Some stories don't begin with words, but with the desert's silence and blood-stained footprints. A woman had walked beyond the limits of endurance, leaving her past behind to face only the death circling overhead. And then, out of the emptiness, a man appeared. He brought no questions, offered no promises. He brought an unthinkable gift, his own boots. This is the beginning of a bond woven from silent gestures, and a journey that proves that sometimes the most powerful healing is born where there is no sound. The sun had swallowed the last milestones. For 3 days she had dragged her feet across a forgotten land, where even the thorny sagebrush had to bow its head and give up. The soles of her feet were a map of cracks, each step a crimson signature. Stamped onto dust as fine as ash dot, the air was sandpaper in her chest. Each heartbeat slammed into her temples like a dry-skinned drum, repeating the sun's burning echo. She no longer counted her steps, only measured time by the shrinking of her own shadow and the stretching of the vulture's shadows, patient circles. Drawn upon a colorless sky, the road rose over a gentle slope, and on the other side, the wavy air suddenly solidified into a form. A solitary figure, moving as slowly as if born from that very trembling heat. The brim of the person's hat was wide enough to swallow an entire afternoon. She kept moving forward, her shoulders set, ready for the question she had learned to answer with silence. But when they met in the middle of the empty road, no words were spoken. The person dismounted in a single fluid motion, seamless as flowing water. The creak of saddle leather, a sound from a world long past. His gaze was fixed on the cracked earth, never looking up. He removed his spurs, then pulled off 2 tall boots, worn from sun and rain, and placed them upright before her bleeding feet. Then he stepped aside, his stockinged feet resting on sand hot enough to roast a handful of beans. He stood there and matched her pace. She stared at the boots, then at the man, then at the endless road ahead. Flies buzzed in the thick air. Her lips cracked open to utter a protest, a thank you, any sound. But the desert had stolen her voice. She hesitated, then slipped each foot into the foreign leather. They swallowed her ankles, carrying the scent of wood and a long finished rein. With trembling hands, she tightened the laces. She stood up an inch taller. The pain now receded, imprisoned behind a fortress that was not hers. They walked east. His horse ambled behind them, its reins hanging loose. The wind shifted, carrying the metallic, rusty smell of a dry creek. Ahead, a cluster of cottonwood trees appeared, a dull green tear in the pale sky, an oasis so small it might have been a mirage. He veered toward it without a gesture. She followed. Beneath the trees, a small stream of water trickled through a hollow in the rock. He knelt, filled his leather hat, and offered it to her. She drank in slow, trembling swallows. The cool water ran down her chin, drawing small creeks through the layer of dust. He filled the hat again and poured the water over her shoulders, washing away the sting of the sun. Still no words, only the creek's faint sigh and 2 heartbeats finding a common rhythm. She bent down to wet her hands. The blisters throbbed. Beneath the borrowed leather, he took out a tin from his saddlebag, scooped out some white salve, and held out his palm. She hesitated, then let him smear the cool balm on her cracked heels. The gesture was so gentle, it felt like a snowflake melting on burning flesh. When finished, he turned away, giving back to her the privacy the world had stripped away. Dusk stained the plains purple. They didn't build a large fire, only embers glowing in a shallow pit. He sliced dried meat, left it on a tin plate between them, and then wrapped himself in his bedroll. She chewed the bits of jerky until her jaw ached, then lay down on the cool sand, watching the stars startle into existence. Somewhere coyotes tuned their thin violins. She awoke before dawn to find him saddling the horse, still silent. He offered her a canteen. She drank. When he was in the saddle, she thought it was goodbye. But instead, he extended a calloused hand. After a heartbeat, she took it and let him pull her up to sit behind him. The horse's breath puffed out ghosts in the gray light. They rode until the sun rimmed the earth, then walked to let the animal rest. Day after day, they walked, rode, shared water, and traded the hat to shield each other from the sun. She never asked his name. He never asked hers. He spoke only to the horse, soft whispers as foreign as the wind. On the fourth evening, a shack appeared. An abandoned telegraph station. He pushed the door open with his shoulder, the hinges groaning like old secrets. Inside, a cot and a rusted stove. He brushed away the dust, motioned for her to rest, then knelt to light a fire. The flames slowly spread, painting the room in amber. She sat on the cot, the boots heavy with gratitude. Finally, as the fire crackled, he spoke. "The road is easier with solace beneath you." His voice was low and rough, like gravel rolling over velvet dots. She traced a seam on the leather, then met his. Eyes, the color of a storm, and steady. "Why?" she managed, her voice a hoarse rasp from her throat. He shrugged, taking the spare blanket and draping it over her knees. "Because silence heals itself, faster than questions." He tipped his hat, brim low, and took the first watch at the crooked doorway. Dawn was a thin copper crack on the threshold. She awoke, feeling the weight of the boots and the warmth of the blanket. He was already up, as if sleep were just a change in the way he stood still. He handed her a tin cup of coffee, thick and hot. A nod replaced a good morning. They set out as the sun began to coat the land in a silver dust. Before noon, a thin black column of smoke twisted on the horizon. They headed towards it. A freight coach lay on its side, like the broken skeleton of a giant beast. Its rear wheel was shattered. Crates were strewn about like giant dice. A small, grimy figure was digging through the wreckage. It was a boy, about 12 years old, his face streaked with soot. When he saw them, he startled, brandishing a broken plank like a sword, until he realized they were not a threat. "My pa broke his leg chasing the horses," the boy stammered. "My ma told me to go get help, but ... He pointed helplessly at the empty expanse. Without a word, John lifted the boy onto the horse, handed the reins to Mara, and jogged ahead. Around a bend, the driver was lying against a crate, his breath ragged, his shin bent at an unnatural angle. John knelt beside the man, not a single wasted word. He used 2 fence pickets scavenged from the wreckage to splint the broken leg, his movements quick, clean, and purposeful. He bound them tight with leather straps. Mara brewed willow bark in their tin cup. The driver drank down the bitter liquid, groaning a thank you. Smoke rose thicker from a crate leaking lamp oil. John used the plank to create a fire break, shoving the smoldering boards away. Mara led the horse and the boy up a hill, her eyes stinging. When the danger had settled into a smolder, the driver pressed a manifest into John's hand. "The depot in Larkspur will pay $20 if this freight makes it. Keep the wagon, just get the seat and whiskey there." The wagon's front axle was still intact. They righted it, using the horse's strength and the leverage of a boulder. John hitched the horse to the makeshift rig, reloading the crates. The boy perched beside Mara, his eyes wide with astonishment as John guided the coach onward. The driver waved them off with a half grimace of pain. The afternoon hazed over with dust. The boy, Nathan, began to chatter once his shock had passed. Mara listened, nodding, her presence a quiet anchor in the boy's storm of words. John offered him a piece of jerky and spoke gentle directions as they navigated the dry washes. Each of his kind gestures bent Mara's heart a little further toward something she was afraid to name. An hour from town, the horse began to lag, unused to hauling such a weight. John walked ahead, the reins over his shoulder. Mara urged Nathan to drink water and used her scarlet ribbon to wipe a streak of dust from his temple, leaving a faint rust-colored mark. Then she tied it to his wrist. The boy beamed, surprised. By that flash of bright color, the evening lights of Larkspur spilled, like copper streaks on the white walls, as they rattled into view. A crowd poured from the depot porch, shouting in relief. The station master counted the crates, pressed 2 silver eagle coins into John's palm, and pulled Nathan into a grateful embrace. The noisy chatter of the crowd pushed against Mara, making her silence suddenly feel like an ill-fitting garment. John sensed it. He pocketed the coins, gave a single nod to the crowd, and then led her down a side street toward a water pump. He filled a bucket, then ducked his head under the pump, the stream of water washing away dust and tension. Mara laughed, a short, surprised sound. She followed suit, feeling the cool water rinse her hair and soak through her thin shirt. Pure. And a live dot at the livery, the owner recognized Nathan and promised to fetch his mother by dawn. A spare stall awaited their horse, and the hayloft held clean straw. John laid out 2 bedrolls. For the first time since the vultures, Mara smelled cedar that wasn't from a fire. It lined the stable walls, and a familiar warmth rushed through her. They ate supper in the loft. Beans and a heel of bread bartered for helping unload sacks of seed. A flickering oil lamp cast their twin silhouettes onto the tawny beams. Mara turned the 2 silver coins in her palm. They glimmered like small suns. "Half is yours," John said. She shook her head. "You found the wagon. Half should go to the horse, too." He smiled at that, a brief flash of teeth. "Then half for Chance." "Chance? A horse needs a name if it's earning wages." His smile faded, shy as if surprised at its own escape. Night deepened. The street noise dwindled to the sound of a single out-of-tune piano from the saloon, drifting through the gaps in the loft boards. In her mind, Mara traced the worn map. From Larkspur, a stagecoach could take her north, to rail lines, to cities, to distances. She glanced at John, already dozing, the hat brim over his eyes, the rifle set aside for once. Her pulse beat a familiar, fretful rhythm. Leave before you need too much. She awoke before dawn to the sound of a horse's nicker, and Nathan's mother sobbing her thanks below. Through a knothole in the floor, Mara watched the reunion, the tight arms, the pure relief. A sharp pang shot through her ribs, as sharp as the stone she had stepped on days ago. Family was a place her road had never led. Later on the depot porch, she read the schedules. El Paso in 3 days. Santa Fe next week. John waited by the rail, his boots dusty, his eyes unreadable. She stepped closer, offering him one of the silver coins. "For the map that got us here," she said. He closed her fingers over the coin instead. "Maps can wait." He tipped his head toward the road east, where the new dust was already glowing in the morning sun. "I have fences half finished." The silence stretched, strong and fragile. She slipped the coin into her coat pocket, then touched the scarlet ribbon. Now back on her own wrist. "I still have miles left to go," she whispered, not knowing if she was speaking to him or to the wind. "And I have boots that fit you," he answered. The stagecoach rumbled in, its horses lathered. Mara watched the passengers board. A miner, a preacher, a woman in feathers. No one looked her way. The driver called, "Last boarding." John remained silent beside her, his refusal to persuade written in his every quiet line. Finally she turned, her back on the coach, dusting the road grit from her borrowed boots. John exhaled, and for the first time, she heard just how tightly he had been holding that breath. He nodded towards Chance. They mounted together, riding east into the morning light. Behind them, the stagecoach rattled away, its plume of dust curling like a question mark that no longer concerned them. The first autumn rain arrived on a wind that smelled of sage and snow from afar. Mara awoke before dawn to the hiss of it against the new fence, each drop a tap on the wire like a traveler knocking. Inside the half-mended telegraph shack they called home, the embers pulsed. She rose quietly, her boots now a natural extension of her feet, and added 2 juniper splits to the stove. John was already outside in the dark. She found him under the lean-to, tightening the cinches on Chance's saddle while silver rain traced rivulets down his bare forearms. Seeing her, he tipped his chin to the east. Flash flood tore up the south fence last night. Need to see what's left before the creek overflows. Mara nodded, pulling her coat tight. I'll bring the tools. They rode out into the gray dawn. The horse picked its steps carefully through the sucking mud. At the wash, the flood had gouged a new channel, 2 yards wide. Fence posts were wrenched sideways, wire swirled into snarled nests. John knelt in the chocolate-colored water, his hand steady despite the icy flow. Setting a rock crib to anchor a new line. By mid-morning, the storm had slackened. As they worked, Mara realized something strange. The rush of water and the creak of new wire were the only sounds. No questions, no doubts. Silence had grown between them, not as a void, but as a fluent language, when they had driven the last staple. Mara's shoulders burned and John's knuckles were bleeding. They ate cold biscuits under a mesquite tree. Creek will settle, John said, flexing his hand. Fence will hold. Mara raised her canteen in a salute. So will we. That evening, they returned to find a rider waiting at the gate. Deputy Stone, her oilskin coat slick with road grime. She dismounted, her eyes scanning the repaired fence, then the 2 mud-blotched figures. Need you both, she said without preamble. Railroad company's back. This time with survey deeds and a judge's seal. They're setting cornerstones at first. Light. John's jaw tightened. He had walked too far barefoot to let noise claim this quiet. What do they offer? Mara asked. Double the last bid. And if we refuse? Stone looked past her, toward the shack and the new, gleaming fence. Then they'll invoke eminent domain. Quietly on paper, but they'll take what they want. John took off his hat, rainwater streaming from the brim. How many men? 12 surveyors, 2 railroad marshals. Mara's breath shuddered. You have until dawn, Stone finished, mounting again. I'll stall them at the county line, but I can't hold back the law with a badge this small. A nod, and then hoofbeats drummed away into the twilight. Inside, the flame flickered. John silently cleaned his knuckles. Mara paced. We could sell, she said at last. Start over somewhere else. John wrapped a linen strip around his hand, his eyes fixed on the knot. That road ended right here. They spread the map on the table. The planned rails cut straight through the south pasture, exactly where Chance grazed and the storeroom stood. Guard, John tapped the river gorge. The only passable crossing is right here. The flood probably washed out their temporary bridge. Mara leaned closer. The creek is up, she whispered. A plan bloomed, simple and lawful. They would do nothing violent, nothing illegal. They would let the creek speak. Under the midnight starlight, they worked. John hauled brush into the shallows, wedging it beneath the single plank bridge the company had laid. Mara drove cedar stakes downstream, weaving wire into a crude dam. The water rose, thickened, until the entire span sat under a tide of thick mud, not destroyed, just unusable. They returned home as the sky turned gray. Soon dust rose. Stone in front, 2 railroad marshals behind, followed by a caravan of wagons. At the gorge, shouts rang out, wheels sank deep. Curses were swallowed. By the mud, Mara watched through binoculars. Deputy Stone produced her pocket watch, tapping it theatrically. Exactly 1 minute past the judge's filing deadline. The lead surveyor hurled his clipboard into the mud. In the afternoon, John and Mara rode down. John offered them planks for traction. Mara handed them canteens. No gloating, just neighborly. As dusk fell, the convoy had rolled back toward town. Stone, grinning and splattered with mud, tipped her hat. "Sometimes silence needs a little weather," she said. John nodded. "Much obliged." That night, under a rinsed clean sky, Mara untied the scarlet ribbon from her wrist and nailed it above the story-room doorframe, a flag of quiet victory. John lit a lantern inside. He hung one of the brass survey markers, a gift from Stone, on a hook. A new object, a new story. Snow fell on a still dawn, erasing every hoofprint, softening every angle of the fence. John awoke early, walked barefoot to the stove, and stood there longer than usual, his eyes lost somewhere far beyond the tin walls. Mara found him there, and laid a hand on his shoulder. He startled, shaking off a distant mood dot as winter deepened. Travelers grew scarce. But on a frigid dusk, torchlight flickered on the ridge. Two figures staggered under the weight of a tarp-wrapped bundle. John met them at the fence. A young woman and her grandfather hauling a broken harmonium. They had hoped to trade it in Dawson, but the church there was boarded up. Its keys rattled like dry bones. Mara showed them to the loft and brewed chicory coffee while John and the grandfather bent over the ruined instrument. Its bellows were gnawed by mice. An ivory key cracked. Still, when John pressed a key, a single shy note sounded in the room. The young woman, Eden, laughed, the sound sharp with relief. "If it can whisper," she declared, "it can learn to sing." Again. The following days transformed the shack into a workshop. Caleb's stitched leather replaced the bellows. The blacksmith's widow shaped new wooden reeds. Each evening, Eden pumped slow chords while snow pattered on the roof. On New Year's Eve, the harmonium exhaled a waltz, thin but certain. Mara closed her eyes, feeling the music fill spaces that even silence hadn't reached. Standing in the doorway, John watched Mara more than the keys. After the last note faded, Eden declared their lodging paid for in song. When the first thaw came, they departed, leaving the harmonium behind as a gift. Mara moved it into the story room. That night, she played tentative scales, and the room answered with soft echoes from every object on every shelf. January storms hammered the plains. When the roof of the old shack groaned under ice, John spent 2 days on a ladder, his shovel flashing. On the third evening, Mara coaxed him to the fire. She gently unwrapped the old bandages and redressed his frostbitten fingers in a silence warmed by the crackle of pine knots. Afterwards, she went to the harmonium and played a simple hymn, a melody that Levi might have known. John bowed his head, his eyes glistening in the firelight. He stayed silent long after the last note faded. From his shirt pocket, he drew Leva's brass button, now with a small hole drilled clean through it. In his other hand, he held a thin rawhide cord. Wordless, he threaded the button, then looped it around Mara's neck. "Not an empty shoe," he said, his voice hoarse. "A compass," her breath caught. Her hands cupped the pendant. She reached behind her, unclasped the scarlet ribbon from her wrist, and tied it around his. "For every mile you walked beside me," she whispered. In late February, Deputy Stone returned, this time with news of the railroad's final retreat. Floods across 3 counties had shifted their survey route north for good. She placed a signed county decree on the kitchen table. Sunrise Bend, recognized as a protected homestead. The right to quiet, codified in ink. John thanked her with a jar of clover honey. Stone bowed toward the storyroom and said, "Keep the shelves ready. The world is still traveling." Spring thawed in a hurried rush, water trickling under the fences, meadowlarks tumbling over new grass. Caleb returned with a wagon full of harness orders. The blacksmith's widow settled into a vacant cottage in the corral. Eden rode back to teach music on Saturdays. Sunrise Bend was now not just a stop, but a place, a center of doing and of done, of laughter threaded through spaces where once only the wind ruled. On a blue evening, she saddled Chance and rode out alone beyond the ridge. Levi's brass button was a cool weight at her throat. She returned to the dry wash where 3 seasons ago, the blood from her feet had seeped into the dust. She dismounted, took off the boots. She pressed her bare soles against the warm sand. No pain answered. She walked 10 paces, turned, and smiled at the perfectly fitting footprints that led the way home. John was waiting at the gate, the red ribbon bright on his wrist. She swung down, took his hand. For the first time, she spoke not of journeys, but of roots. "This ground keeps stories alive," she said, her voice soft but certain. "Let's raise a bigger room." He nodded, his forehead resting against hers, their breaths mingling in the twilight. "We'll need extra shelves," he murmured. Under the first stars, they laid out markers for new walls, cedar stakes in the soft earth. The cat, Eli, stalked crickets between them. Chance snorted at a breeze full of wild clover. Somewhere inside the house, the harmonium hummed in the evening draft, a low, sustained note, like the breath of the ranch itself. And on that hush, deeper than any words, warmer than any noise, Mara and John began the next chapter, building not a stopping place, but a lasting home. Each nail driven to the rhythm of a silence that healed on contact, and of hearts that had found their own. 4 winters had passed since the first stakes were driven. The bigger room was now the heart of the house, its cedar walls darkened with time. The fire in the hearth burned steadily, and on the new shelves, new stories had found their place. Hawk's feather, a broken stone arrowhead, a tin whistle left by Eden on her last visit. Snow was falling outside again, but this time it was not an enemy. The flakes were large and soft, landing on the windows and piling in thick blankets on the fence. Inside, Deputy Stone, her hair now threaded with more silver, sipped a cup of hot tea. She had come to report that the new rail line was finally complete. 50 miles to the north, a world away, loud and distant. Nathan, now a tall young man, sat across from her. He had ridden all morning to deliver a packet of letters and a small gift for Mara, a fossilized shell he had found in the dry wash. Mara took it, feeling the ancient ridges under her thumb. She rose and placed it on a shelf, next to the brass survey marker. A new memory from a land that never stopped telling its stories. When their guests had departed, leaving hoofprints that faded into the snow, Mara and John stood by the window, looking out at the sleeping land. The lamplight from within cast their shadows onto the doorframe. He said nothing, only raised a hand to touch the faded red ribbon on his wrist. She responded by unconsciously touching the brass button at her throat, its metal worn smooth from countless absent-minded gestures. It was a conversation without sound, repeated over years. Somewhere in the house, the cat Eli, now old and lazy, stirred in his sleep. The horse, Chance, breathed evenly in the stable. Their silence was no longer a shelter from the world, but the foundation upon which their world was built. Steady, peaceful, and full of wordless stories.